Good afternoon. Welcome to our informational meeting. First item on the agenda is a city staff report from Deborah Owen, our city clerk.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Sioux Falls City Council. Just a heads up for you that on February 8th, there will be a resolution before the council brought by planning, which will reschedule your joint Lincoln City and Lincoln County meeting to be at the same time as your Minnehaha County meeting on February 15th. So we'll have all of three bodies at the same time at the 5 o'clock joint Lincoln, Minnehaha, and City Council meeting at that time. Thank you.
Next item is Mayor Munson's office. I think they're going to have a presentation for us later, so we'll move on. Audit Committee, no report. Fiscal Committee.
We'll meet next Monday after the informational meeting and discuss the process of where we're at in the record retention records process.
Okay. Land Use Committee.
I'd like to report that we will be meeting tonight. Land Use Committee has a meeting tonight.
Okay. And Public Service Committee.
No report.
Any City Council open discussion? Councilor Knudsen.
One date that I forgot to mention for our public calendar, I should have double-checked this, but I think it's the next meeting of the Sioux Falls City Councilors and the Lincoln County Commissioners and the Minnehaha County Commissioners, I believe, is Thursday, March 11th, because, you know, we don't meet every month. It's that fairly new networking group, and I'm sharing that for people who are listening, not for us up here. And anyway, and so we meet every 2 months, and we've met, I think, 3 times now. It's a very good collaborative discussion, I think, and we meet at 7:30 a.m. at the Hy-Vee on Minnesota Avenue, and I just wanted to put that on our calendar.
Any other open discussion on the council? Okay, we'll move into our presentations. We're going to reverse the order a little bit, and we have a new one. We're going to have an update by the Planning Department on City Sidewalk Ordinance.
Good afternoon. I'm Brent O'Neill from the Planning Office. And last week our office sent out a memo to the council talking about an ordinance that will be coming up in February meetings. And we wanted to use this meeting just to give you a quick update and answer any questions you have on it. We had a couple meetings in October where we gave some presentations to some public folks, and I'm going to give you an abbreviated version of that today. The first thing I just want to mention is why we have a sidewalk use ordinance at all, and that really stems from the fact that right-of-way, which encompasses our sidewalks and streets, is reserved for transportation purposes and the movement of people, pedestrians, and goods. And generally, all other activities are prohibited on the sidewalk. So this ordinance does sort of serve as an enabling legislation that allows us to do that. And with that, like the cafes and pubs, the placement of objects, performance artists, and so forth that you see downtown are allowed to occur through this ordinance. And this ordinance also allows us to promote the orderly use of public space. Our current ordinance was drafted in the 80s, and since then many things have changed. You'll see in that third bullet point that the number of permits we've issued annually has increased significantly. Downtown is more active, and the types of uses are more intense. What originally started as a vending ordinance for activities such as hot dog stands has become, in full-blown cafes that are having an intense use of space. And the regulations in there do tend to be fairly vague. Our office partnered with Downtown Sioux Falls about a year ago and formed a stakeholder group that had representatives from basically every interest we could pull together downtown. And with that group, we reviewed other cities' ordinances, looked at the things that were important to Sioux Falls, and then looked at things that we felt would work best here and were agreeable to everyone. By October of 2009, we had a draft in place, and at that time we shared it publicly in 2 meetings. I'm not going to read this list here, but it does just give you an idea of the scope that this group went into. It's about 30 topics there that we discussed, ranging from how we're issuing permits to insurance requirements, alcohol, various things. The rest of the presentation here is going to talk about kind of the key aspects of what the new ordinance is proposing. One of the important things, like I mentioned, with right-of-way is to maintain the transportation aspect for pedestrians and others. So what we developed is kind of a two-zone system for the sidewalk, one being a pedestrian pathway, the other being a furniture zone where basically any object, table, sign could be placed. The pedestrian pathway is intended to remain free and clear for pedestrians at all times. We shifted from the old system, which was a vending license, kind of a one type of permit that was supposed to catch all uses. It was also known as a sidewalk use permit, and it was $35 annually. We shifted that into a three-tier system for those minor uses like placing signs or bookshelf carts or plantings. We're just simply going to require a notification to the city that includes a hold harmless provision. There would be no fee associated with that. Permits are what's most like the old ordinance, and that's again for those intermediate uses of vending, performance acts, things that are kind of used in the sidewalk on a temporary basis. And then the third category we're calling a limited lease, which is for those intense uses like a cafe setting up tables literally for an entire season, 24 hours a day. And that, again, would be $35 annually. Another important aspect of the ordinance is the space that is being leased or permitted really needs to be delineated. That was something that the committee we worked with strongly recommended. And the real purpose of delineation is so when patrons are out there, they kind of know where, if there's a cafe, where the cafe starts and stops, so there's not sprawling of these activities up and down the street. And then I've just got kind of a list here of what some possible delineation standards might be. The next two slides show examples from other cities on different types of barriers or pavement markings used. And then the next slide shows an example of what a restaurant at the State Theater would look like with a little bit of a bollard and rope. Another important aspect was whether or not we wanted to address occupancy limits. And the committee felt, and through discussions internally, felt that an occupancy requirement was a bit overboard at this time. What we did instead was look at space and furniture and how much furniture could reasonably be placed out there. And we came up with a limit of one chair could be placed in that space per 10 square feet of usable space. So technically, there's really no occupancy limit that would still allow people to stand and be there, but it does prevent overcrowding of furniture. I want to show you these two pictures. The one on the left with safety barriers is something we were trying to prevent. You can imagine, particularly on a 10th Street where traffic is moving fairly fast, having chairs on the curb like that is a dangerous thing to do. So on the right, we're just proposing that there be some sort of protection, whether or not that's actually a barrier in place. If there's not a barrier in place, we'd request that the chairs be placed a certain distance from the curb. 12 inches ended up being the distance we agreed on. Alcohol was another topic we discussed in quite a bit of detail. And again, in a leased area, those intense uses, we would allow alcohol as long as the adjoining establishment had a valid alcohol license. It would be prohibited everywhere else. And then one requirement that would go along with that is that it must be purchased indoors or from wait staff. The committee and then our staff, as we were working on this, really felt that dispensing out on the sidewalk was more than we were able to handle in this ordinance. And then similar to the conditional use permitting process, where crowd management plans are required and security management plans are required for conditional use permits related to alcohol, we would basically have the same feature here. And in those cases where they already have a CUP, it would just simply be an addition to that plan. Noise was another topic of discussion, and noise is not really handled by this ordinance. It's handled by Chapter 25.5 of City Ordinances, and that's administered by the Health Department. And Health Department is going to be talking at today's meeting also about the noise concerns and the changes that might be coming on that. And then the last thing I want to talk about, because events in downtown were alluded to in the old ordinance, we shifted that around a little bit. We clarified the process for events downtown. We've in the past had the events calendar approved by the council annually. That's still going to be in there. There was a thing that allowed events to preempt sidewalk uses. We've changed that a little bit, so only promotional events can do that, and that'll really trim the 30 or so events that had the ability to preempt a sidewalk use permit down to maybe 4 or 5 every year. And I think that was something that was really important, in particular to the people downtown that do have retail space and cafe space. And then I just want to point out one final thing, that since about November, we've had an internal team working on doing a better job of disseminating our information on the events process. And so that's something that's still a work in progress, but we intend to have very soon, and there actually is a ghost site out on that right now. With that, I just want to say thank you for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and I've also invited Jeff Dans, who was on our committee, to give a statement about our process as well, so he can do that at any time also.
Councilor Knudsen, do you have a question?
Brent, thanks for your presentation today. You helped me, maybe you said this and I didn't quite hear it. What, in that category about physical delineation, what again are bollards or bollards? What are those? B-O-L-L-A-R-D-S? I can't think what that word is.
I tend to think of them as, something that are kind of shaped like this microphone a little bit. They're a certain height, and they just kind of give a delineation.
Okay.
Oftentimes there's ropes hanging from them.
Okay.
So they're.
I just don't know that word. Sorry.
Yeah.
And I was trying to think if there were those great big huge planters. Not that. No, that's not right. Okay. And next question is regarding the seating bit. I mean, it looks like there's more distance being suggested among the tables than many restaurants that I eat in Sioux Falls, and I eat out all the time. So my question is, how does this configuration as far as seating compare to, this one chair allowed per 10 square feet of usable space? How does that compare in real life to inside restaurants?
This would actually allow just a few more chairs than a restaurant. And again, this is probably not drawn to scale, so that might be partly why it does seem like there's more space there. But oftentimes in a restaurant, that standard is 1 in 15 feet.
Okay. And I mean, just a thought, and this is just, I need to think about this more, but I mean, I myself don't really, I almost find that more detail than, more regulation than we need. I mean, it just seems to me that if I had a place downtown and I were trying to seat people, that at the point that it was too crowded that people couldn't get up or down, that, that would be common sense kind of thing. But anyway, next question is when it says, as far as the alcohol section, dispensing devices that, those could not be outside. And yet, and yet at festivals, at outside downtown festivals, I mean, there are alcohol dispensers everywhere. So I'm just saying, so why the difference?
At a festival, we'd have that exemption in there. We do have that for events. The main reason was, at these cafes, I think people, when we were working with our committee, and we also worked with the police department a little bit on this, they didn't want it to become a situation where every cafe was setting up its own keg or other type of device on the sidewalk. So I just wanted to keep that a little bit under tighter control.
Okay, thank you, Brent. And then my last question for now anyway is, I know all the time that I've been on city council, we have, or almost all the time anyway, about every year, we've approved the downtown special events calendar, and that seems like more, I never ever know as a city councilor why I need to approve the downtown special events calendar. I think there's some, it's in a regulation or an ordinance or whatever, but I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that, or when I say your thoughts, I mean the department's thoughts, on that is that a little bit over-regulation for us?
Well, I know when this first ordinance was drafted, going back to the late 80s, the real purpose of the events calendar, to my knowledge, was simply for that preemption clause where you have those cafe permits or the vendors out there, but when there is an event, the intent was to allow the event to kind of take precedence over any of these other permits. And that's really where I think the calendar has evolved over time. It has come to serve, I think, other purposes. I think it helps the city departments understand that it's council-supported events, that sort of thing. I think it makes it a little bit easier. I know as far as like trash and garbage service, having that calendar has helped the Public Works Department manage how they're assisting in providing that service after events.
Yes, and I understand what you're saying on that, and I guess, like if I were a new merchant, however, downtown, and I mean, of course, I think I'm just really supportive of downtown Sioux Falls and everything they do together, and obviously it's very important that they all among themselves know kind of who's doing what when, and, but it just seems like if I were a new merchant downtown or even an existing merchant downtown and I decided in the middle of the year that I was going to have a kite festival. Recently read about a kite festival, and I like that idea. And it's like, it just seems like, okay, so it's not in the official calendar, but can I still have the event? And I don't know. I just always wondered if that was really necessary at a city council level.
We've actually had that conversation internally, and without having a clear answer, thought that at this point maybe it was better to leave it as it was. But certainly, we're still open to that.
Councilor Bennigan?
I guess before we go too far with the conversation up here, I'd like to hear from Mr. Dans about his opinions about the process and the decisions that were made. And since he's a downtown merchant, I think it's important that we get his viewpoint.
My name is Jeff Dans. I'm a property owner downtown as well as a business owner, and I'm also a resident. So I was in 3 of the constituent groups of this whole process. I was on the task force, and there were a very divergent group of people with a very divergent group of interests represented. And to that point, I think it's appropriate to recognize the patience and talent of Erica and Brent in managing those meetings over many months. As you can imagine, there was some strong feelings, and there were a lot of elements that were carved out and compromised over a number of meetings. And it is, Dee, you brought up the idea that perhaps we were micromanaging too much. Those aren't the words you used, but that we're legislating too much in this process. And it's the feedback that we heard a little bit when we had our public meetings. I think what we came out of this process with was a balance between definition, regulation, and trying to create an environment where merchants and residents and visitors could all enjoy downtown and find some balance and harmony. Some of the things that might appear as unnecessary regulation actually allow people to do things like put a planter out in front of their store. We spent a lot of time as we went into this process. If you looked at city ordinances, it's illegal to have a table tent out on the sidewalk announcing your specials for the day, or perhaps a cart of used books in front of the bookstore, or some plants in front of your store. We tried to modify the sidewalk ordinance to do 2 things: to allow those merchants to have things that we feel provide some of the color and uniqueness of downtown, but at the same time allow the city to protect the considerations of the pedestrians, the handicapped citizens who use downtown, and to protect the interests of the city in the event of there being some, the hold harmless element. So some of these things that appear to be unnecessary regulation really are a way of addressing the unique nature of downtown and to free it from some of the existing regulations or the interpretations of the existing sidewalk ordinance. I guess I would just take your questions. In closing, would just say that I think this was a very thorough and fair process. It's not the ordinance that I would have written if they would have said, Jeff, go write the sidewalk ordinance. It's not the ordinance that my neighbor Tim Kant would have written if they would have sent Tim off. But it's the kind of ordinance that I think if you put Tim and I in a room together long enough, we would have come up with. Thankfully, we didn't have to go through that process. We had a lot of people to have input and to help cobble out this compromise. And when I say compromise, I don't mean that in the negative way that sometimes compromise comes out of committees. I think It's a very workable ordinance that allows the city some flexibility in how they regulate things, and in turn allows business people and merchants and residents and the citizens of this community to enjoy downtown as well.
Councilor Jameson?
Just a question for Brent, actually. Thank you, though. Brent, what's the timeline if I want to get one of these permits? I'm a business owner down there. How long does it take to get this permit?
Our process is going to be changing from the old one where we kind of had a inter-office mail approval system, and I hope this new one is one where we can probably turn these around in 2 weeks or so. Ideally, we develop a process where, because these are coming up annually and we typically see them all in March, I'd like to arrange something where we can do something at least in March for those people that get those permits in early to really streamline the process for them.
If I've got some special event that just an opportunity presented itself and I want to do it tomorrow, Saturday, it's with a couple of day notice, what would you guys do to?
If it was a special event, where would you require a street closure or anything?
No,
of that nature?
I just want to have something special out front of my store, and I don't have any permit for it, but
To do something out front of your store, I think we could really turn that around quite quickly, particularly if it's on just a smaller scale, where, for example, on that lease level, those intense uses, we'll have quite a bit of city review, police, health, fire, our department. But something a little bit less intense, I think we could turn that around within maybe 3 or 4 working days.
okay.
Councilor Stichels?
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering about the turnaround. Like Greg was saying, just some really minor things. Going to take really 3 or 4 days? Could it take maybe just a couple hours or something?
If something was, in those 3 categories, we had the notification, we had the permit, and we had the limited lease. If it was something just a matter of setting out a couple carts or something, just for a day or 2, I would consider that part of the notification. And really, that is an almost instantaneous process. That's just going to be a form to the city saying, hey, we want to do this. And then that statement or that form is also going to have the hold harmless. If you were to set up something where you actually wanted to have a hot dog vendor out there, that's, I think, where we start looking at the city having to review it among our departments.
Okay.
Councilor Anderson?
With the Section 2932 special events, you're looking to repeal that. What's your timeline on replacing? I think you were talking about coming up with a new special events ordinance, or
Yeah.
is that just going to be repealed totally?
What we did in the short term was, in an effort to clean up the ordinance a bit, we shifted what was repealed in Article 3 to a new section, Article 5. And the language is just a little bit clearer, but the content is essentially the same. And if you do have a handout, it would be page 15 in there. That starts at Section 2992.
Thank you.
Brent, do you know if there's a new establishment that we're going to open up and they were going to have 30 seats or wanted to use 30 seats outdoors, would their facilities, restrooms on the inside take that into accommodations, or how does that work?
In this ordinance, it does not. We did examine that as part of our process, and we looked at it from several aspects. One, whether just the demand created that need. 2, we looked at what the building code requires and how our building services section interprets building code towards that, and that is something that our building code does not address. So, to just use the example of a restaurant, I'll just say Bracco because I know they have an outdoor seating area. That does not count against their restroom requirement either.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Since it relates to this, I thought we'd take the next item be the noise ordinance. Judy Boosman from the Health Department will present that.
we're not sure do you have copies of the noise ordinance available to you? We didn't see them attached to the agenda, so we did just quickly email them to you, so they should be in your email process. Sorry, we sent them over, thought they would have been attached, but if we didn't make the deadline, I'm not sure. So while you're looking at that, I'm just going to give you kind of an introduction. But the reason we're bringing forth some changes in the noise ordinance were twofold. I think you've already heard planning and Mr. Dance speak to that some of the discussions as they were looking at their sidewalk ordinance started earlier in the year. We had participated in those. So we're finding that as they brought up some ideas and suggestions, there has always been specific clauses about noise within the noise ordinance for the downtown district. So again, there was their planning group came together and came up with a consensus. We've included that language change. But then also, as we looked at 2009 was just a different year for us for noise, and we started to say, what's different? A couple of things were identified. We had more residential bars and establishment that were conducting events or outdoor concerts in a limited way, and so we looked at the number of permits. Our permits increased significantly, and that was the particular event that was causing that. We were processing more permits. There were also, as they became closer to residential areas, neighbors were looking and saying, how does this affect us? So there became those kinds of discussions as we talked back and forth with neighborhoods. And as we started looking at those issues, we started then comparing with doing some research, looking at how people were looking at those kind of issues of enforcement, of permitting, and we expanded that look and started to say there are some changes that we want to make to this, but really the fundamentals of our ordinance we are leaving in place. So as you look at the ordinance, you'll see some significant writing. But as far as our substantial changes, there's really 4 areas that we looked at substantial changes. Those substantial changes first came in some of the enforcement area. We had a criticism from some of the people who frequently get permits. As they looked at that violation, they said, we had one violation and we can't get permits for a year. So we're changing that piece. As we looked at people who get permits on a regular basis, we're creating a monthly process. So you can submit that monthly plan and just do it through it, not on a more frequent so you can get a permit that covers that entire month. Then we also looked at from the perspective of the enforcement process, as we are working on this, the noise ordinance is really enforced and by both police and by health. So we put together a planning group early this summer as we were seeing this change in the number of events that were occurring over. So police and planning have been involved in that process. We've had focus groups with the downtown group has been identified. We've also sat down with some of the what might call the frequent flyers, people who get noise permits frequently, so to get some input from them as we put together those changes. So we've integrated those discussions into the process. And one of the things, as we said, we've had an increased volume, but one of the questions we asked ourselves for a significant change is which one of the permits really are significant? Which kind of events really need to be permitted? So we've decreased the number of, we had almost 300 permits this year, and we're decreasing by, if we were looking at this year as a repeat in 2010, we'd have about 39% fewer events that would require permitting. So we're really looking at the ones that are causing the discussion. Where do we need education for people to understand how what they're doing affects their neighborhoods? With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jill to talk about, but before, as she's coming up, just pointing out one piece that we found in another ordinance that we don't really use public policy statements, but I thought it helped us put in perspective. As we look at noise, we're always looking at that. How do you mix the business element with the people element? And this statement said it quite well. It is the policy of this city to promote an environment free from excessive noise, otherwise properly called noise pollution, which unnecessarily jeopardizes the health and welfare and degrades the quality of the lives of the residents of this community, without unduly prohibiting or limiting or otherwise regulating the function of certain noise-producing equipment, yet is not amenable to such controls and essential to the economy and the quality of life in this community. And I think that sums up some of what we sometimes think we're balancing. It's that business aspect and the people aspect. And I think Mr. Dance described the rich discussions that go along with that. But that's the place when we look at permitting, how do we work with establishments to be good neighbors? And that's what we found ourselves doing this year. So what I think police found themselves doing as they were looking at enforcement and the kinds of changes that we're looking to this ordinance to make a difference in the way it works now for both those establishments and for some of the people who no longer permits, and then also for keeping the enforcement process.
Judy, just 1 second. Councilor Steiger has a question.
Judy, you mentioned the enforcement is done by the health department and the police department. Can you delineate exactly what?
That's what Jill's going to do,
Okay,
is
Jill's
give
gonna do it.
a little more detail into those substantive.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Jill Franken, Assistant Health Director. I will draw your attention to the overstruck or underscored version, as I will be referring to both the sections as well as the page numbers as I walk you through the changes that we made in the ordinance. As Judy described, most of our changes were substantive that I'll be talking about. We did, however, do a number of changes that are definition changes, cleanup of language, as well as revisions just to provide more consistency throughout the ordinance. And then we also removed some items that were really never fully utilized. They were very technical, somewhat scientific, and really didn't apply when we were talking about either the permitting or the enforcement side. They may have had some scientific relevance for us as a department, but certainly didn't necessarily apply in the actual ordinance language itself. An example for that I will draw your attention to is the example on 25.5.3b, which is found on page 8, and that is the correction for duration of sound. That would just be an example of something that we removed. Those are quite technical in language and terminology, and we just simply don't use that anymore. Moving on then, items that we moved some items in order to be more appropriate in the sections of the ordinance, and I will draw your attention to 25.5.5 on page 10. Those were items that were previously found to be in the prohibitions or exemption sections of the ordinance, but actually found that they were exceptions to the ordinance. So we removed those and added a section that is under exceptions. I'm not going to go through those. They're fairly self-explanatory, but we found those were better served to be in its own section under exceptions rather than trying to be defined in a prohibition or exemption area, which they did not really apply. Then also, I'm going to just now talk about the substantive changes that we applied to the ordinance in the draft. 25.5.5, number 4 on page 10, is referring to private events in city parks for an hour or less. This would be an example of something that we found no longer applied under the permitting process. As Judy talked about, we had about 39% of our permits last year were found to be weddings, those kinds of things that are held, and primarily that's what it was weddings that are, less than an hour, for the most part about a half an hour, and we really have never gotten, for the most part, complaints on those. So we really felt like those were not applicable. We were applying that to the permit process, but it no longer seemed, it is no longer relevant in our minds as far as the permitting process. Then I take you to 25.5.6, 4, 5, and 6 on page 11, and those would be those items that are within the permitting process itself. Number 4 is, there are no significant changes to this, but I did want to draw your attention to it because the change that we did make was to allow for peaks of sound to be measured as well as an L90, and this is where the technicality starts coming in. But in very simple terms that I can also understand, are certainly our sound experts in our department are much more scientific oriented than I would be in this regard. But they manage and monitor sound based on an L90. They have meters to do that, and that when they need to be drawn in to do that education to those entities that are applying for a permit, they do talk about L90. That's how they measure when they go out before an event starts and do all the readings. They use an L90. Law enforcement, if they go in and they're looking at it based on a complaint process, their meters use a peak. They measure based on peaks. So what we did was we looked at what makes sense if we want to get to a maximum decibel level that's measured. Then what are those peaks? And how can we measure that over a smaller time frame, which right now in L90 would be over 10 minutes, and do that over a manageable time frame so we can actually be measuring from the permitted source. So when someone maybe has to go downtown because they're having to help, a law enforcement officer has to go downtown to evaluate the level of sound or anywhere in the city, they can use that peak measurement as opposed to the L90, and that still gets us to the same result of what we're trying to look for. I sure hope that is explainable to you, and I certainly will be answering questions as needed. Then we go to the changes that are in Section 5 that are for downtown Sioux Falls specifically. We did make changes to include that downtown Sioux Falls can be permitted up to 70 decibels or peaks of 77 until 10:30 at night, except for Friday and Saturday, in which they can go till 11:30. Those were the changes that we had a lot of discussion about with both residents and the business folks in downtown Sioux Falls. They had great meetings. Dan Stadema did a great job of pulling everyone together, including our department, law enforcement, the attorney's office, to really sit down and make sure we came to consensus, everyone, on that ordinance. And this is what they felt the residents could be satisfied with, as well as the business owners. So that is the change that's going on. It changed. The other thing that we changed in that ordinance is just said, this is what you have to have for maximum, instead of the language in the past that said you can be X amount over at this time and X amount over at this time. We just said, here's what you have to be at this time, and here's what you have to be at this time. Made it much more straightforward. Then we also added changes to 25 and a half, 8, 6, and 7 on page 14, which actually add in additional enforcement language. As those changes, what we had previously, item 6 is a change. And one of the reasons that we changed both 6 and 7 is it replaces what was previously in ordinance, or recommending that be replaced, the statement that says no permit shall be issued to any applicant or any activity convicted of a violation in the previous year. That was one of the sticking points that we had some significant trouble with recommending going forward, and in place of that, we are recommending more of a compliance review process by our department. If someone is having some issues with managing their sound, and they have 2 or more, either notice of violation or for whatever reason a citation written, then that is going to cause a compliance review to be completed by our department with that entity. And we are hopeful, and we've been very successful in the past of being able to then reduce issues after we have done more significant work with that particular, whether it's we have not had issues with the residents themselves, but establishments that perhaps are having some issues managing how they emit their sound from their outdoor event, or even from within their indoors as well. So we are going to complete a compliance review if we find that we're having more than 2 issues where they have perhaps a notice of violation. We also, and this was really regarded as very much a positive by all parties that we have talked to, is to allow residents the ability to petition if there are ongoing issues that they experience with noise coming from an establishment. And that's in other ordinance that we looked at. We looked at quite a few cities and how their ordinance is written for noise, and we found that this was also something that we would like to implement in ours. So if more than 25 residents sign a petition stating there's an issue with a certain noise coming from an establishment, that then will also draw a compliance review to be completed by our department. It allows the citizens some ownership in being able to take care, to address that situation with us and notify us of that, and also it assures that we are paying attention to what's going on in that area. And then application fees is the next section. That was 25 and a half, 16 on page 14 was created, and In your version, there may still be reference to a $50 fee, which needed to be removed when we set this section in the draft. And it's been many years since we have increased this fee, and so we're recommending for the single event application that we increase that to from $50 to $60. We also, in response to folks that want, that maybe they apply for a lot of events that they want to have outdoor activities where they have noise or entertainment, they can also then do a monthly application. It still gives them a permit for each of those events that they want to have, but that allows them to perhaps do that once a month rather than every single weekend. And then a special permit would be what was previously known in our ordinance as a variance. A variance used to be something that was more related to like emergency construction issues or road work, those kinds of things. And it's over the last year or two, that's become more, someone wants to have an event that's maybe going to run a little bit later, and it's also going to be a little bit louder than perhaps what's in our permit process. And so that would be a special permit. And those fees are outlined, as you can see, on that page as well. We also added a past deadline fee because if you, perhaps it's Thursday, and you now all of a sudden want to have an event or something outside on Friday and you want to apply for a permit, that takes a lot of extra work on our part to get that set up for someone. So we've added a different past deadline fee for that. That is, in a nutshell, the changes. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. There are folks here from the Attorney's Office, law enforcement, as well as planning who were part of helping us with this.
Councilor Anderson?
A couple questions, Jill. Let's see here, would be section 25.5, 6 for the permit, number
Okay.
4 and 5. Now, if for the regular permits here, it says will expire at 10:30 unless otherwise stated for number 4 on that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if a business owner wanted to have something less or past 10:30, is that going to drop it into the special category as far as charging them?
Under this, it would. You're correct.
What additional work would be necessary under that scenario?
Additional work, I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, charging $140 more, I assume there's more work involved.
For the scenario he's talking about where, okay. We had in our meeting with folks that are not business owners downtown, but rather in our neighboring bars and restaurants that hold outdoor events, that very issue, and we identified they could perhaps have a special permit if they wanted to go louder or later than 10:30 at night or that decibel level. What we discussed with them is we have not had the opportunity, no one has had the opportunity, and, well, let me rephrase that. The residents of those particular neighborhoods, which there are many, because we have more and more neighborhood bars and restaurants that are looking to provide outdoor activities, they have not taken that same approach to pull all their neighbors together and people that live within range of their particular establishment together to say, what do we all agree on? Downtown Sioux Falls is a very unique district, and we recognize that. And they did that. They took it upon themselves to pull the residents as well as the business owners together and come to a consensus on that. We don't, this particular, to manage every single entity and understand that their particular area and neighborhood agree to that, that would be, we said we could certainly do that in the future. This is our best ordinance for those kind of neighborhood establishments that we can find and that we would recommend at this time.
Okay. I guess I'm just looking at it, and basically it looks like we've got two different playing fields here still. Where the downtown Sioux Falls, I understand that they've gotten together and done this, but why can't we use that as a model for the other businesses outside of downtown Sioux Falls, instead of charging them that extra, $110 or so, because they just want to have it maybe an hour later, just like downtown Sioux Falls businesses do. That's the one thing I just see. I just think that that's something we need to look at.
And that's certainly why we're bringing that here today, to give you a chance to look at what our best recommendation is based on the discussions that we've had. So,
Councilor Staggers?
Yes, Jill, in regard to the enforcement question, we have the police and the health department involved. Can you explain that a little bit more in detail as to who does what, the police and what the health department does for enforcement?
Luann, I'm going to ask Luann Ford to come up and talk a little bit more about that as far as the difference between.
I'm Luann Ford with the Health Department. Can I have you re-ask the question, please?
Yeah, Luann, when it comes to enforcement, it's been mentioned that we have the police department involved and also the health department. Could you delineate, in more detail about the health department enforcing and the police department enforcing?
Sure. You mean which scenarios would be police and which would be health? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that'd
sure.
be fine.
Sure. Well, the health department has the ordinance in front of them, and they have in the past had the major enforcement responsibilities for that. But what we found was that we did not have the staffing for 24 hours a day, and so often that's when noise is happening. When there's noise complaints that come in, they're coming in at midnight or 11:30 at night. And we just didn't have the staff to cover 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for when the complaints were coming in. And so the police department was taking on a larger and larger role in responding to those complaints. And so what we wanted to do was make the ordinance a little easier for them to enforce when they're out there with a sound meter that's maybe not as high-tech as the one that the health department has, so that they can use their meters and their knowledge and skills to still enforce the ordinance without having to have exclusive training in the operations of a technical sound meter in order to get the job done.
So I guess my question is, why should we continue with two different organizations enforcing this ordinance? I can understand, the health department not having people 24 hours a day, but how about maybe just putting this exclusively on the police department to do?
That's a good question. Sound also has a health aspect to it, however, because there are certain sounds that when they're too long, too loud, adversely affect the population. There's been many scientific research papers done that show that extended exposure to loud noises can cause aggressive behavior and adversely affect people's emotions. And for that reason, the health department has had the guidance over this ordinance. It's more to it than just taking decibel readings. It's also working with people when they have an issue to determine what the threat is, whether it's just an annoyance, a nuisance situation, or whether it's something that's adversely affecting their health. And then once that determination is made, over the long term, the things that can be done to correct that so that neighbors can still coexist together with business people wanting to make noise and the neighborhood wanting to live a peaceful and quiet life.
So I guess, would it be fair to say then the police are going to be the primary enforcers of this ordinance when it comes to, in terms of decibel ratings? They have a meter, they can kind of determine whether, a noise ordinance is broken. But then the health department would deal with other issues, maybe more than just dealing with decibels, or is that fair to say?
It all kind of works together, really, because the way the sound, what the police have for sound meters are basically field units, which means that they can ride around in the trunk of a car and not lose their calibration when they're being bounced around on the road, whereas the sound meters that the health department has are more of a technical scientific instrument. And the difference between them functioning is the health department meter can record. and it will record over a span of time and calculate averages and give you, like for instance, the L90 reading that the police department meter won't do. It'll just read what it is right now. That's where the peaks come in at. As far as the enforcement of it goes, how it's going to work is that when the police department has a concern at a facility, they have the option to write a citation, write a notice of violation, or write a report, basically just telling the health department, this is, something's happened out here, depending on the situation that they see at the time, and how immediate of an issue they need to correct. And then at that point, then it goes to the health department, and then we take the information that the police has provided and use that to make an education opportunity to determine, is there a public health issue here? Is this a nuisance issue, an annoyance issue, or is this something that we're just going to say, okay, we've documented it, if we continue to have a problem, then we need to make further decisions?
Yeah, the reason I'm asking this question is because, I've heard different statements from people saying, well, we've had a complaint here about the noise at an event or something like that, and then maybe the police will come, and the police might say, well, no, this is something for the health department, and it gets a little confusing as to, who's supposed to.
That's why we kind of wanted to work this together, why we work so hard with the police department and the attorney's office, so that we can make an ordinance that we could all work with together so that we can eliminate some of that confusion. We don't want a repeat of that.
So you think the confusion is eliminated now as to when the police will be responsible and then the health department will be responsible?
That's our goal, yes.
With this ordinance?
Right. Well, with this ordinance and lots of work, yes.
Luann, when there's a complaint, where's the measurement point?
When there's a complaint, we're looking at that differently too. Up until now, it's always been at the closest receiving land. And if you look at like the base readings on there where it says, residential district, it still says in there at the closest land that's being affected. But by procedure, we're going to start moving that to the complainant's property because they need to see the system working, basically. The complainants need to have that personal contact so that they can know what's a violation and what isn't, and whether or not there's anything that can be done about it.
So that's been incorporated in these changes?
Right.
Okay. Councilor Anderson?
Guess it's, what type of training do the officers get besides just reading the meters? As you said, there's a lot more scientific aspects to this. So what type of training does the health department assist the police department in for these officers to determine, what route they need to go, whether it's a citation, a report, or actually calling in the health department?
Sure. We have two officers in the health department that are trained, that have been to training, not only on the use of the meter, but also on ways to alleviate the impact of sound within neighborhoods. Because there's lots of things that an establishment can do to help control the sound that's going out. And what we want to do is be a resource to the public so that we can help them solve that problem. And then as far as the police department goes, we hold a training session with the police department, basically in the spring, because that's when the sound issues start becoming more and people open their windows and people want to be outside more, is when we have more concerns that are raised. And so we have just a little refresher course that we offer the police department. We calibrate their meters for them, and then I believe the police department has also tape recorded that class, so as they have new officers come in, they can continue to show that.
Thank you.
Councilor Knudsen?
I actually have some questions for Jill, please.
Oh, okay.
And you probably could answer them too, Luann, so. Jill, so this overall proposed ordinance refers to merely outdoor events or all events? In other words, a nightclub in town that has really, really loud music. Does it apply to that too, or is this just outdoors? I guess I should know that, and I don't.
The sound ordinance applies to all sound in the community.
Okay, all right.
The permitting process then would be primarily looking at those items that would create enough sound that we would need to make sure that there's a permit for that. That has typically been outdoor events.
And second question is, under this proposal, would businesses be able to get their permits quickly via email? I mean, do they have to drive downtown and fill out paperwork? That's my question.
In our work to create this ordinance, that procedural avenue would be explored. That we have not gone to that next step of looking at how they can get their permit. I will tell you there's a fair amount of education that has to be done on the front end, but as someone does regular permits often and we have a real comfort level, that would certainly be something that we could put in place for the future.
And then I hadn't thought about, I mean, it's an area I don't know at all, but I hadn't thought about fees as far as sound permit application and fees. And so would most communities charge fees for people? I mean, I realize, I suppose that's a way of recouping some revenue to help pay for, the health department and police department doing very valuable work, but I didn't realize that we would be charging fees.
Sure. The reason we charge fees is because of the work that's done to actually give that, assign that permit and to approve that permit. We did look at some other cities and what they are doing. Minneapolis, for example, they charge $134 per day. That's as of this morning even. I was just updating, making sure they had just raised their fees not that long ago. And so the per day of an event that you'd want to have their charge would be $134 for a permit. Des Moines, for example, goes from a single-day permit for one day of $40 up to, if you go by the month, it's $200, and a year-long, they have different types of permits that they allow, and that would be $300. So we did do some looking at some various other communities. That would be a couple of examples I brought with me.
And then last question for now on this is, just regarding the, incredible technical description on page 13, for 2 and 3, as far as the 5 peaks of 77 dBA, and again, that's totally like Greek or to me. I mean, I don't understand any of that, but going a step further, would the average place that hosted regular outside events, I mean, would they just readily understand what that really means in English? I mean, would they, I just don't know. Does an owner of a bar restaurant, or would they themselves own sound meters, and would they be able to interpret that or not?
Actually, we find that there are quite a few business owners or managers of businesses, bars and restaurants, that they are very understanding, very knowledgeable in their role of how to manage sound, how to deal with sound. They are usually from areas where sound permits have been the norm, and they're very comfortable with understanding those decibel levels. Some even have their own meters so that they can measure their sound at an event and make sure they're staying within the maximum allowable decibel limits. So if Luann has any other thoughts on that, I'd welcome her input as well. But we do find, now, on the other side, there are many establishments that also may not understand. I personally, last summer, received phone calls from managers who said, I need to understand this whole sound permitting process. I just took over managing XYZ establishment, and I don't understand this. So then there's that education that comes in, and we sit down with them, and we work quite extensively with them to help them to understand and get up to speed with what they need to know and how they need to protect their neighborhood or the community around them. So.
Any other questions? Councilor Jameson?
Jill, Judy had mentioned that this year there was a projected, I think, 30 or 40% less activities planned this year than last year. Was that right?
That would be if this ordinance were to be put in place.
Okay, because a lot of those would be eliminated. The weddings would be.
Exactly.
What kind of revenue are we talking about as far as these fees would generally generate in a year? And are they relative to something? I mean, like the number of people you have on staff, the equipment needed, anything like that?
I have to remember our revenue. And Luann, do you remember the revenue at line? We generated in revenue it was right around 5,000 to 8,000 in this last year with our sound ordinance. And then the second question was related to our expenses.
Well, is there any relevance to the fee that you're charging to the what you're doing with it, I guess?
Yeah, and I apologize, I didn't mention that in my presentation. We plan, as we did with restaurant fees, to take the same approach. And so knowing that we're making some changes to this ordinance, there will be certainly a little bit of difference in how we are working with the public because some of those permit fees will no longer apply, such as those private events that we talked about that we are eliminating from needing up, in the parks. And so we'll be looking at how any of these changes affect how we approach sound, and we know how some of those are going to affect sound, and we'll be looking at that expense and then adjusting our fees accordingly in the future.
Councilor Anderson.
Jill, I want to thank you and Judy, Luann, the police department for working with downtown Sioux Falls to correct the issues down there and also working with the outside businesses. I think you guys did a great job on this. I've been one that has talked about noise ordinances and special events ordinances, and I just want to say thank you guys for taking a look at it and making the changes that I think will be beneficial to everyone.
Thank you.
Councilor Staggers.
Yeah, just a clarification, Jill. On the single event, the permit cost is $60. Okay, then if I don't meet the deadline, then I pay an additional $90. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so a total $150.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
No, that's not an additional $90. That would be $90.
Okay,
Yes,
so
sorry
it's
about
actually
that.
an additional $30 then. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Benninga.
I got a dumb question.
Oh, I don't.
Jazz Fest, we all heard some, don't laugh, it's not the first one. Jazz Fest last year, a lot of us got some calls. I'm just using it as an example. It was fine during the day. At night, wind comes up, and we got inundated with some conversations. How do you control that kind of thing? I mean, it's fine when it's still, and all of a sudden, you've got a whole neighborhood that's affected.
I really should ask Luann to answer that question, because there you're getting into a very good question, actually, and it's one that we deal with on a regular basis, which is some of the reason that some of the complaints occur. So,
You really have touched on what makes this job so difficult. It's not just speaker placement and which way you point the stage. That's all very important. How many trees are between you and the closest residents, that's all very important. But weather is the big undeciding factor. Because if there is a weather inversion that hangs right over the top, there's been times that the entire city has been able to hear an event. And how does the body control that? I don't know. But the idea is to be responsive to the needs. And when we get complaints, we need to let the health department, police department, who's ever responding at the time, know about it so that they can work with the event coordinators to help control that impact. And I know that at the time that the weather is actually happening, you can turn the speakers down, you can try to control the soundboard and which way the speakers are pointed, and try to stop it from happening again. That's our goal, is to do what we can to control it at the time, and then do what we can to stop it from happening again.
Thank you.
Any other questions regarding this? Okay, thank you very much. The last presentation we have today is a code enforcement update by Mike Cooper, Director of Planning and Building Services.
Good afternoon. I am Mike Cooper, Planning and Building Services. Last year, as we had different discussions with the City Council about questions regarding code enforcement, we made a commitment that we would look at in the future providing more periodic updates to you. probably on a 6-month basis. And so this is our first opportunity to kind of bring you in with an overview, a more comprehensive overview of code enforcement. And so today I'm going to focus in a little bit more about what's happened last year and what are some things that we're going to be doing this year. The Public Services Committee has seen some of this information, but this again is an overview. This will also be part of a comprehensive annual report that we'll put out for the public as well as for the City Council to look at in more detail. So, first of all, some of the different activities that we got involved with last year, coordination efforts between city staff, looking at a better way of dealing with statistical information and summarizing that, focusing on collection of citations, updating our website, providing more public education and outreach, being more proactive with different neighborhood groups, and then looking at performance goals for this current year regarding code enforcement. Last year we began bi-monthly meetings, and actually before that we were meeting on a monthly basis as we first got into looking at all the different city departments that deal with aspects of code enforcement. Our coordination meetings typically have representatives from 10 different city departments. I think the ones that don't get involved would be library and human resources, but I think just about everybody else has some involvement. And so typically we have around 30 people that attend those coordination meetings. We've also established a code enforcement team site, which is an online electronic way that we can not only track the statistical information, whether it's a complaint or a citation, but we can also communicate better with each other on the status of a particular address or a particular action that's going on. This is a chart that shows you a summary of our code enforcement statistics for last year. And since, at least to me, it's a little bit fuzzy, I'm going to look at my copy. This shows you by different city departments on the left-hand side of the column the number of cases with violations, the number of invalid cases. In other words, if there was a complaint and we determined that it was not a violation, a number of inspections that were completed, the number of complaints or violations that were addressed after the initial notice, and then going through the citation process. And at the bottom, we have some of the conclusions for last year, that 83% of the cases that had violations were brought into compliance after the initial notice. 16.5% of the cases with violations went through the first citation of $100. 3.5% went through a second citation of $200. And then 1.8% of the cases received 3 or more citations. So by the time you get through the citation process, we're getting close to that 99% compliance. The next chart is one that the City Attorney's Office is tracking for us, and this is information that they're keeping track of on a 6-month basis, which is the citation collection process. And this again is for 2009 to kind of give us an idea of what happened last year. At the top, it says the number of collection actions filed by the City Attorney's Office in 2009, and that was a total of 41 cases with about 177 citations, totaling $33,800. The next line for last year was the number of collection actions where cases were still pending at the end of the year. Then we had 2009 collection actions where a court judgment have been or are in the process of being obtained by the City Attorney's Office, and the citations were not yet paid. The next category is collection actions where payment, either partially or in full, was collected in 2009. The next category is citations that were forwarded to a collection agency due to the amount of the citation or the inability to serve a defendant with civil court action. And then the last category is citations that are ready for court action and to be included in the next city attorney's docket for filing. So these categories kind of give us a snapshot every 6 months of the status of the collection of citations. And if you look at this in the middle of the chart, it shows you that last year we collected $8,830 of citations. We are making progress with this new process, but as you can see, there are still cases where it takes time to go through the citation collection process, either through the courts or through a collection agency. And but again, I think we're making progress in dealing with these on a timely basis. The next chart, or graphic, I should say, shows you an example of our website that we put a lot of effort into last year to update that, to provide more information to the community on code enforcement. And if they have specific areas that they want information about, what is a violation? Because many times what we'll find out is people will complain about something and it's really not a violation after we've gone through and investigated this. But at any rate, our goal is to provide the public as much information as we can about the code enforcement process. And if they do have questions about a potential violation, this will help them get directed to the right location. We've also spent a lot of time last year on our website with our listing, a posting of administrative citations and complaints on a 12-month rotating basis. And this gives people the ability to go online and they can look by address to find out where complaints have been made, the status of dealing with those potential violations. And again, this has taken a lot of time and effort in working with all the different city departments so that we have consistent ways that we put information on this on the website. Public education and outreach. We have a who to contact brochure that's really coordinated through the health department, and I believe that we're working on a brand new update of this. One of our major purposes of doing this is for Project Nice and Keep. We put together a lot of copies of this that we can give out to the community. But again, this is our way of providing public information on different places to contact depending on the type of concern or question. And this is one way that we reach out to the community to get better information about the code enforcement process. Another step that we made last year was contracting with Helpline. When people call 367-8000, it goes to Helpline. And that service began on January 12th of last year. And now it's expanded to a 24/7 process. Last year there was a total of 5,900 calls received and referred to different city departments from the start of that contract. What we have on the list here are the largest volume of calls that went to different city departments, primarily for code enforcement or questions that people had about other city services or processes. With our online complaint process, last year we had 1,421 online complaints. And again, this chart shows you the volume by different city departments. Public Works, the Health Department, Parks and Recreation, Zoning, parking for sidewalk snow removal, dilapidated housing. This is, again, we can provide more detail of this breakdown, but this kind of gives you an overall summary of the online complaints that we took last year. Project Nice and Keep is our primary way of reaching out to neighborhoods, and Health Department, along with other city departments, will be determining again this year where that neighborhood process will take place in April. But this gives you a summary for last year that we took out 371 truckloads of waste from the Hilltop neighborhood, which was our primary focus for Project Nice. We also did cleanups in both Pettigrew and Whittier. Pettigrew was a neighborhood volunteer cleanup. 3,580 pounds of trash were removed in one day on September 26th. And the Whittier cleanup, the fourth annual, was over 50 tons of waste was removed. I wanted to include just a quick summary of our National Citizen Survey because I know that was presented to the City Council last week. And we just pulled out a couple of the questions that were asked within that survey pertaining to code enforcement. And this particular question said, to what degree, if at all, are rundown buildings, weeded lots, or junk vehicles a problem in Sioux Falls? And I think the outcome was pretty good. That showed that 7% of the respondents said it's not a problem, 44% said it's a minor problem, but there was still 34% of people said that it was a moderate problem, and 7% said it was a major problem. There was another version of that same question of please rate the quality of code enforcement. And again, this shows you the responses. 8% said it was excellent, 28% good, and 31% fair. These are all above the national average and above our other benchmark communities, but I think it still gives us some sense of what people's concerns are. And I didn't break this out by city council districts, but we do want to do that because I know that was another key indicator of a lot of the survey questions of different parts of the city probably have different rates of response. So we want to go back and look at that and just see if there's correlations within the older neighborhoods, which we probably would expect there to be of maybe higher rates of dissatisfaction. Now, having said that, another way that we are dealing proactively with neighborhoods is through our Housing Resource Center that we established last year at the Bowdoin Youth Center, of trying to provide programs, educational opportunities for people to come in. And we have a whole variety of topics that we offered last year. We've had neighborhood meetings with Pettigrew Heights, with Whittier, and then most recently with neighbors of Cathedral. And I'll tell you that we have a small group now of the Cathedral neighborhood that we're meeting with. They initially submitted a listing of 8 potential code enforcement complaints that we're going through and tracking. Some of those we're not able to address until the snow melts, but we now have a good working relationship with a small core group of Cathedral neighbors. Tomorrow night there'll be some meetings with the Whittier neighborhood, and then we still have our monthly meetings with our Pettigrew Heights committee. We've established partnerships with the South Dakota Multi-Housing Association, and again, working through them, we offer some basics of property management classes for property owners, for tenants, as well as landlords. This graph shows you a summary of code, I should say complaints that we've tracked since the year 2000 within our core neighborhoods. And starting in 2006, you see the numbers going up, which I believe is partially due to the fact that we began to be more proactive at that point of working with the neighborhoods. And so I think there was a more tendency for people to contact us about complaints than in previous years. And the good thing is that some of those neighborhoods have started to show a decline, particularly if you look at the Whittier neighborhood at the top of the chart. And we have that broken out into more detail too that we can provide. We've also got more, we began to get more proactive last year with demolitions. And this shows the location of all the demolitions that occurred due to code enforcement, the locations of those. We budget money each year to go out and go through the demolition process. And one thing that I'll mention later on is that process is very long and time-consuming. That can take up to 2 years before we go out and actually complete a demolition project. Foreclosures, we also track. This is a pretty busy map, but on the sheriff's website, we tabulate those on a monthly basis, and that's part of our discussion when we meet with the different coordination, when we have our coordination meetings with the different staff, because we want to make sure that if the water has been turned off, or if there's other issues that we know about the addresses, so that if we begin to get complaints about sidewalks or weeds or other property issues, we have a way of knowing the status of those properties in terms of foreclosure. The next graphic just zooms in a little bit more about our core neighborhoods. And actually, the number of foreclosures in 2009 went down slightly from 2008. But this shows you, for each of our neighborhood areas, the number of foreclosures where the water utility has been turned off and where it has not been turned off. And so again, we continue to track this on a month-to-month basis. As we met with the Public Services Committee, we talked about some of our goals for this year in dealing with code enforcement. And quickly, in terms of simplifying the complaint process, we want to put together a comprehensive citizen's guide to neighborhood nuisances and violations. We've looked at other communities that have done this, and it seems to be a very effective way of still providing more public information about the process, and again, trying to eliminate confusion about what is a complaint or what is a violation, what types of complaints can be made, and who should they go to. Continuing to work on timely enforcement and compliance, looking at better ways of using our rental registration ordinance and our vacant building registration requirements as enforcement tools. Primarily, it helps the different city staff know who to go to if there is a complaint of, we can go back to if the property is a rental property, and we can look at that registration and find out exactly who to contact, and it helps speed up the process. As I mentioned earlier, the building demolition time frame right now takes up to 2 years. We'll be coming forward this year with some building code amendments, and one of those that we'll propose is to speed up that building demolition time frame to approximately 18 months. And we'll explain in more detail the rationale for that, or why it's not 6 months and why it should not stay at 24. Through the attorney's office and others, we want to continue to look at ways that possibly we can adopt stronger penalties for multiple violations and habitual offenders. Are there still ways that we can continue to streamline the compliance timeline for notices and citations within different city departments? There are different timelines, again, depending on the type of violation and complaint. We would like to continue to look at maybe making those more uniform. Another one that we've talked about is utilizing our code, our maintenance code authority to go in and correct violations by actually contracting with a contractor. In some cases, if we have a violation that might be a window that's broken or a railing that's broken, and it doesn't get corrected, but we continue to issue citations, there may be a case that it's probably easier just to go hire a contractor and have them go on the property and fix that violation. But then you get into issues of going on private property, and so there's a little bit more complication to it than that we want to investigate a little bit more before we make that decision. Another thing that we've looked at is with the foreclosures, is there a way that we can acquire vacant properties or condemned structures faster for potential redevelopment? Particularly our community development office is interested in this. Right now, if it goes through the county tax deed process, it can take up to 5 years before we would have an opportunity to acquire a vacant or condemned property. Randy Bartunik has been in contact with some of our state legislators about some possible legislation that we could support or craft that potentially would help to speed up this process. And then finally, we're looking at increasing the voluntary compliance process. Again, what can we do to even be more proactive with our neighborhood organizations and with even more better outreach programs? And then what can we do to provide more regular reports of inspections and enforcement action by the type of action and more specific locations? And the annual report that we're going to be working on for 2009 is a beginning point of doing that. So that's a very quick overview of code enforcement. And if you have any questions or things that you would suggest that are missing from this or detail that you would like to see in the future that would be more beneficial to you and to the community.
Councilor Staggers?
Yeah, Mike, you mentioned in the report that we collected $8,830.
Yes.
Yes.
For 2009.
Yes. Do we have any idea how much it cost us to actually collect $8,830?
I do not have that information. I believe that's something that maybe we could look at, but
Yeah, just to check and see about the cost involved in collecting that sum of money.
I would have to visit with the attorney's office to see if there's a way of looking at that correlation.
Councilor Knudsen?
Director Cooper, thanks for the update. Is that I just think we're making some good progress here on an issue that we've been talking about for quite a while, and I think that was helpful to me to see the responses from the National Citizen Survey because it kind of helps you see the forest from the trees sometimes. Just a couple of questions is regarding the, I know the call's been going into 211, and so what kind of training have those people had, or are they just mere message takers at this point?
You want to answer that one?
Erica Beck, City Planning Office. Central Services is actually responsible for the contract between the city and 211 Helpline Center, and they've conducted several training opportunities with the 211 staff to basically make sure that they understand our process. They all have copies of that Who to Contact brochure. That way, when someone calls, they have a question, who do I get in touch with, talk about, animals or waste or anything like that. They can refer directly to that specific brochure and then transfer that person to the correct department.
Thank you. And then another question, Mike, when you were referring to 2 citations or sometimes more than 2 citations, so I don't remember what our cutoff is as far as number of citations, and we're done doing citations because obviously at that point I assume citations aren't too effective if they're just being ignored. So what's how many citations are you going to give me for not paying attention to the ordinance?
We have a 3-stage citation. The first one is $100.
Okay.
The second one is $200, and the third one is $300. There are cases when, as we've met with the attorney's office, that we've actually issued more than one $300 citation.
Thank you. And then as far as the court system, I realize that is a very slow creature. Is right now about what is the backlog for us to get before a judge to have these more serious ignored cases heard?
Right now, the chart that I showed you showed that there's there's a total of 52 cases ready for court action for code enforcement.
Yeah, so that's still quite a few in line, isn't in queue, so it's quite a while, I guess, to get into in front of a
And
judge.
some of these actually go back previously for 2009, but they've gone through the citation process, and then we're now taking them to the attorney's office. And we did also start later last year with that new state law that allowed us to go to small claims court. That law didn't go into effect until after July, so again, I think this year, hopefully we'll see some of this court action go a little quicker.
And so on that, back on that website, and I was trying to look at it pretty carefully, but on the screen here, so at the point that a case, like I'm really watching a particular situation in my neighborhood, which I'm not, but if I were, and so is it readily clear on the website that we're waiting to get into court on that?
I believe so, yes.
So people don't wonder what our delay is, because at that point, it really is out of our hands. It's in the judicial system's
So we have
hands.
Again, we have all the different city departments working to keep that website up to date.
And then I was wondering, my last question is, for today, is, did we ever seriously consider in our ordinance just putting, I mean, after so long, just putting liens on properties?
Well, we do special assessments in some cases.
Okay.
When you get the annual parade of people that come in about snow removal and weeds and trees, those are special assessments that have gone through a violation.
Okay, and then there's actually a lien on their property at that point, you mean?
I don't know if that it's a lien, but it's an assessment against their property that they have to.
Okay,
So I think it would be classified probably as a lien if they don't pay it.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Litz.
Mike, this is something that's near and dear to my heart, and I've been paying close attention since we got here. And like you said, it's a work in progress, but I see a lot of progress on this, and I want to thank you for your leadership on this, because I know where we were at when we started on this. So once again, Mike, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Councilor Brown.
I'll echo that as well, Mike. Thank you for, this has been a long time in coming. We appreciate the work you've put into it. One question for you. Those individuals that call to make the complaint, what kind of a process do we have to follow up with them so they know that the city is making progress? Obviously the website, but are there other methods that we're using?
We actually do provide them if they would like to get an update, then we'll, and sometimes it's anonymous, they don't want to have anybody, follow up at all, but in many cases, if they ask for an update, we'll give that to them, either electronically or phone call, whatever it takes.
Great.
So that's another way that we're trying to be a little more customer-friendly and customer service, so people know the status of those
I think that'll help a lot.
complaints.
And then, since it is the season of snow removal on sidewalks, I see that Randy is here, and I'm sure you probably don't have specific numbers, but in general, could you let us know how this season is going? I know last year was a tough one. I would imagine this one is as well.
Yes, it is. Randy Bartunik, Director of Community Development. It is starting out probably worse than last year, mainly because of the Christmas snowstorm. We've probably received in excess of 650 to 700 complaints already this year. And recognizing that one complaint may involve many different properties, and kind of give you an example, it is out by 57th in Minnesota. It's kind of a new area of town. There's sidewalks in there. Somebody wanted to walk their dog, and it literally involved about 3/4 of a mile. Fortunately, we do have a process that we're informing those developers of an application where they can actually apply to close or vacate the maintenance on that sidewalk in those areas. But it still takes a lot of time investigating ownership and doing the inspection. So we're behind on it. We've got literally my parking managers pretty much dedicated full-time. We've got 2 parking patrol that have been committed to the inspections, and then we've got 1 city engineer that's helping, but we're probably about 200 behind yet at this point. So if you get calls from citizens wondering and saying that they've called and it hasn't been cleared, that's part of the problem.
Okay.
We're doing the best that we can on it.
Councilor Knudsen.
Director Bartunik, not on the snow removal, but back on that comment that Dr. Cooper made about the need to change a state law regarding the time it takes to get property demolished and so forth. I was just wondering if there was anything the city council could help on that. I mean, like, is there? I mean, this is the 3rd week of the legislative session, and so obviously the deadline for bills will be before long. I don't remember the exact date, but I mean, I know the first legislative coffee is this Saturday morning, and some of us see legislators once in a while, not too often. But anyway, is there a proposed bill that you want us to help with? Because we're going out to Pierre next week for Municipal League Day.
I've not had a bill drafted, but I was originally working with Senate Representative Patrick Kirschman. I forwarded Vernon a copy of that letter last fall about some issues that we feel that from the state law does need to be changed. One has to do even with properties that are being sold on tax deeds and tax sales, because we looked at it through community development, buying some of these properties that were probably on the verge of being tore down but had been delinquent in taxes. We looked at buying them. The problem is even as a buyer, when you buy it, you're not getting clear title. It's still subject, so there may be clouds on it. So one of the things that we looked at is through that process, and that would be something that the counties have to get involved in when the law is changed, is that when there is a tax sale, they've got to have a means of conveying clear title to it. Otherwise, who's going to be wanting to buy these properties? Because there are also, there's a number of things that this property is going to be subject to liens and everything else. And then the other thing is just kind of from the overall timeline. When the county has to wait, 3 to 5 years to put these properties up for sale, that's ridiculous. If you're living next to a property that's been abandoned and you have nobody that's paying the taxes or taking care of it, there's got to be a way or a provision, in my feeling, in state law that allows municipalities through the counties to take possession of them and get them sold, get them back on the tax rolls. That's where, like I said, it's going to take a lot of, I think, involvement by the state and the legislators on that process. But all I'm recognizing is that there are some problems and holes in the system that we've got. I think that would help probably Mike's process quite immensely if we were able to take a little bit quicker action on them.
Well, and I would just like to encourage you to, like, if you'd even want to send us a simple summary of this. It seems to me it's prime time. I mean, it even seems like it might be an area where the municipal league might want to be involved, and to me this is very doable, but I think it'd be helpful for us to talk to quite a few legislators, including the leadership from both parties. I think we could maybe get this done if we get really going on it.
There's a couple examples where houses have already been tore down, fortunately, by the city, where you've got that assessment against it. Taxes have already been behind or unpaid 3 to 4 years. Well, it sits there. Now you're going to get complaints in the weeds to the Parks Department. You're going to get complaints in the sidewalks to the city. So to me, it doesn't make sense why the laws are set that way, that you have to wait that long. And I would think that through some process by defining what abandoned is, because I understand that maybe sometimes there's clouds and issues on the property where maybe somebody can't step forward immediately, maybe it's through a foreclosure or other reasons, but when it truly has been abandoned, whether the bank's not stepping forward or anybody else, that process has to be expedited. And what I can do is I can forward you all a copy of the letter that I had sent Representative Kirschman. I think that kind of explains some of the concerns that we found.
Councilor Staggers?
Yes, Randy, you mentioned earlier about that issue with the snow removal on the sidewalks, and then you mentioned something about they could close down or vacate. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, what that is really on the outskirts in the new development areas, because there are some areas that have been brought into the city limits. Sidewalk has been put in, but there really is, I would call it like a sidewalk to nowhere. If there's a sidewalk there, but there's no destination on the other end. And so, yes, and if you didn't have that application process, and the one example that the complaint that we received out in 57th in Minnesota, we would literally have to require several different property owners, developers, to clear about 3/4 mile of sidewalk, when in all likelihood nobody's going to use it.
Yeah.
And so that's what that process is for, is if there's a sidewalk that's put in because of a new development, there's no other residential, no other businesses in between where you can expect public to be going to or from, that's what that process allows people to do.
Also, if I could just follow up. So theoretically, anybody could ask for a vacation of the sidewalk?
I suppose they can ask, but I would guess it's not going to get approved.
Yeah,
if you're in a
right.
residential area where you've got, it is being used and you've got surrounding neighboring properties, it's not going to get approved.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Jameson?
Randy, I hate to even ask this because I live in a new part of town. I've got a vacant lot behind me. My sidewalk ends at a vacant lot. Could I get that vacancy thing or
You
not?
can make the application down to the city engineer's office.
Just do that? Apply with that?
I would, we've had an example, I don't know your particular situation, where in a new development, there was one house in the middle of the block. It's obvious the call that we received was very vindictive. Somebody's calling to complain on it because there was no property, no sidewalk in either one. We made the determination, it's a sidewalk to nowhere. We let it go. Now, if you're in the middle of a block, but you've got residential homes all the way on the one side, maybe vacant next to you, we would probably still require you to clear that because your postmen and others are going to be using that. Postmen, I guess, even paper delivery.
Any other questions on this topic? Okay, thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is an executive session, and I would throw it out to the council. It's not a time-sensitive issue, and we have nothing on the agenda for the informational for next week. And there is a public service meeting after this. Considering the time of the day, would we...
Land
Or
use.
land use, I'm sorry, land use meeting after this. Do we want to maybe defer that till next week?
Sounds good for me.
If I could say something about the Land Use Committee, we're going to start right away. So.
Any concerns by deferring that personnel matter? Seeing none, then we'll do that. Any other open discussion for the City Council? Seeing none, we are adjourned.